Storytime about how my grandmother predicted that I would get kidnapped when I was 14 years old. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. My grandmother and I have always had a very close relationship. We're Mexican and my grandmother believes in ghosts and legends. In the town that we lived in, there was always a legend about girls who got kidnapped. When I turned 7 years old, my grandmother told me that I would be kidnapped when I was 14 years old. My parents and I didn't believe her. My grandmother never let me out of her sight after that. Even if I was going to go to the park and play, she would always come with me. It wasn't until I turned 14 years old that it happened. I was walking home from school and it was the first time that I was walking home by myself. Somebody was always there to pick me up, but this time no one was there. The crazy thing is that my grandmother got confused on the day, so my parents didn't think that they needed to go pick me up because they thought my grandma would. As I turned a corner, a man snatched me up and put me in his car, and he had the scariest mask on. He looked like the devil. My grandmother instantly knew that something had happened to me. She ran over to my school, but I wasn't there anymore. For 2 hours, the man drove me around in his car looking for a perfect spot. Whenever I would ask him where he was taking me, all he would say was, "I'm looking for privacy." When he first took me, he tied my hands behind my back. He threw me in the back of the car, and every now and then he would turn around and grab at my clothes. He was trying to rip the clothes off of me. But every time he would try to grab my clothes, I would bite him really hard. I made him bleed several times, but this only made him angrier. We finally stopped in a supermarket parking lot. That's when he told me to stay quiet and he left the car. But I was more afraid of what he would do with me if I stayed than if I left. I managed to get out of the car without him seeing me. I ran for a minute before I heard him screaming behind me. Reached a highway and a woman stopped her car to help me. She took me back to my parents' house and that's when I found out my grandmother had had a heart attack. She knew that I was kidnapped and my parents went crazy. They took me to the hospital, but I was actually okay. I went into therapy for years after that. Legend has it the man is still kidnapping girls. I drive my car every single night in the same route that he drove me. What should I do when I find him? Am I the asshole for wanting to expose my lying, cheating mother? A month ago, I borrowed my mom's phone and she had no idea, but I looked at all of her apps and found that she was cheating with multiple men. I'm 26 years old and my parents have now been married for 30 years. I actually got separated when I graduated from high school, but then they got back together a few years later. My mom has always been the one that wants to separate my dad, but he keeps wanting to get back together with her. My dad is actually in love with this woman. He adores her. He does everything for her. He's super affectionate with her, loves to take her out on dates, gives her so much of his time, and she still doesn't appreciate it. I've always been closer to my dad than my mom. My mom's always trying to find an excuse to go party with her friends, but now I know why. Like I said, I ended up borrowing her phone and she probably didn't expect me to go snooping. And honestly, it wasn't even my intention. I'm scrolling on her phone and I see the app Tinder. I nearly fell out of my seat. So I quickly scrolled through everything and started taking pictures. My mom was sending nudes to random men. Part 2 is up. Am I the asshole for wanting to expose my lying, cheating mother? That's when I saw that she was sending nudes to men on different apps. Not only was she on Tinder, she was also on Bumble and an app for older people. Mind you, my father is still in love with this woman. I managed to take pictures of everything on the apps. Here's the worst part. Start going through her messages and that's when I found that she has a boyfriend. At that point, I didn't know how long they'd been together. Now I know that she's been with him for 6 months. So every single time she goes on her weekend trips with her friends, she's actually with her boyfriend. And get this, she uses my dad's money to pay for everything. An entire week passed before I confronted her. First, I didn't know how to confront her, but I had to just do it. Every time I saw my dad, I would start to cry and he was worried about me. I didn't have the heart to tell my dad until I confronted my mom. I went up to her and I showed her all the receipts I had. So she got pissed at me for looking through her phone. By the way, at this point, I'm still living with my parents. That's when she threatened to kick me out of the house if I told my dad anything. My own mother threatening me. Then she tried to smack me across the face, so I smacked her. Part 3 is up. Am I the asshole for wanting to expose my lying, cheating mother? After she slapped me, I slapped her back. And I slapped her so hard she actually fell on the floor. I instantly felt bad and tried to apologize. That's when she started to cry and I started to cry. I asked her to just be honest with me and tell me the truth. She told me that she wasn't in love with my dad anymore, but that she felt bad for him because he was still in love with her. And that she'd been dating this new guy for 6 months. She even confessed that she was addicted to going on dating apps and flirting with men. That's when I told her she needed to tell my dad. That she needed to stop using his money to take her boyfriend out. Then another confession. She had spent over $25,000 on hotels that she would book for her and her new boyfriend. And apparently this guy was broke. He couldn't pay for himself. She tried to negotiate with me. If I don't tell my dad, she'd break up with her boyfriend and stop using the apps. I mean, she's my mother and I don't want to cause her pain, but it's my dad. I ended up telling her that I wouldn't tell my dad. But 2 nights ago, my dad went on a work trip. My mom is so stupid, she actually snuck in her boyfriend through her window. I heard them doing the dirty all night. Now she's begging me again not to tell my dad. dad. I'm planning on telling my dad tonight. I'll have to keep you guys updated. Give me advice. Story time about how my neighbor tried to unalive me. 4 years ago, my husband and I had just moved into a new neighborhood. We were newly married and were trying to have kids right away. My husband and I were also really social, so we would invite our neighbors over and host parties. We had a really big, beautiful house with a pool, so we always took advantage. Mostly everyone on our block would come to our get-togethers, but there was always this one couple that never showed up. I didn't think anything of it until one of my neighbors told me not to invite them to any other event in the future. When I asked her why, she said the police would go off into their house, and that the husband and the family was suspected of abusing the entire family. Obviously, after this, I stopped inviting them. Every single day I would go on walks with my husband. Well, one night my husband decided to stay home, so I went by myself. I decided to change my route and walk in front of the neighbor's house, the one everyone was scared of, and as soon as I turned down the street, I saw a man by the window. I looked away really fast because I didn't want him to think that I was staring, although I was. Suddenly, his front door opens and he comes outside. And all he says is, "You're the new neighbor, right?" I simply replied, "Yes, and nice to meet you." He stared at me for a few seconds, didn't say anything, and closed his door. I obviously thought this was strange. I kept walking, but a few minutes later, I noticed that he was right behind me, and something told me to run back home, which I did. That's when I realized he knew where I lived. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my neighbor tried to unalive me. Disclaimers is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I ran back home as quickly as I could. I told my husband that the neighbor followed me home, but he told me to just forget about it. A few days later, I come home from running some errands. I get out of my car, and out of the corner of my eye, I see my neighbor standing behind a tree, and I could tell that he's looking at me. I decided to just ignore it because I didn't actually want to have to make conversation. Instead, I grabbed the groceries and walked into the house. I began closing the door, but he pushed his way in. I backed away and asked him what he wanted. He asked me if my husband was home. And no, my husband was not home, but I said yes. Then he looks around and asks me if he could get a little tour of the house. He also said that he really wanted to see the pool. Okay, I know what you're gonna think, but I was so scared I thought that if I just showed him the house, he would leave. I walk him over to the backyard and he starts looking around. That's when he asked me if we had any security cameras. My hands and knees started to shake, and once again I lied and said yes. He started looking around some more and said, "Nope, you definitely don't have any." I told him I needed to leave the house and if he could just leave. He starts to laugh and tells me that I should be nicer to him. He ripped my phone out of my hands and threw it into the pool. Instantly, I sprinted away from him. He grabbed my hair and I fell really hard to the ground. Part 3 is up. Part 3 of how my neighbor tried to unalive me. Disclaimers is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. He pulled my hair hard and I fell to the ground. That's when I just started kicking as hard as I could. I heard him scream and he fell back. I got up and ran straight back into the house and locked the door behind me. He came up to the door and started banging on it. He told me if I didn't let him in that he would break the door. That's when he grabbed a chair and started throwing it against the glass. Luckily, the windows are hurricane proof, so he couldn't come in. I called 911 and then my husband. I went around the house locking every single door and window. He would just follow me from window to window yelling at me. He told me he just wanted to talk to me and that I was overreacting. Finally, I could hear the sirens around the corner. And of course, he started running away. Finally, the cops found him. His pockets, they found zip ties, and his car was loaded with rope and different things. Apparently, he planned on taking me to the woods. He's now in prison, but I'm so scared that he'll get out. What should I do?